Hi, so my name is Sarah McKeon, and this is my project on Mormon women and polygamy. Um, my research question that I started with was, how were polygamous women represented in the media, and how did women attempt to defend polygamy in Mormonism, and how effective were those attempts to defend polygamy? And my thesis was, Mormon women defended polygamy by claiming that it allowed for greater female autonomy, was protected under the First Amendment, and was divinely sanctioned by God. And in general, those defenses were ignored and ridiculed by the world at large if they were acknowledged at all. So for the historiography, for a long time, there wasn't a whole lot of research. There was some research done into polygamy, but there wasn't a whole lot because members of the church felt pretty uncomfortable with polygamy and researching it after the manifesto, as I think a lot of us can understand. So there's not a whole lot of resources, especially looking into the female side of things. And that's begun to wane in recent years as books like Saints have come out, and people have become to be more curious, and it's become more acceptable to research about polygamy. The most common type of resources that are research about polygamy are those that start with the initiation of polygamy in Nauvoo, and go up through the proclamation of where they stopped polygamy. And there's lots of books written like that. Another type of really common resource is one that compares themes of polygamy, not a common type, an uncommon type, but really valuable type of resource for me in my research was comparing themes of polygamy in Mormon women's public and personal writings. And these are, and this basically just synthesized a lot of the arguments Mormon women made in the media, and then also identified common themes in their journals and writings. And so that was really useful. But because there's not a whole lot of research on it, like this is really the only source I found that does that. I had journals and newspaper articles and magazine articles were super important, and specifically magazine articles. Here's the Book of Mormon Polygamy. You can see the Woman's Exponent was absolutely crucial for me in doing this study because it was the main vehicle that Mormon women used to defend polygamy at the turn of the century, when there was lots of anti-polygamy legislation being passed and a lot of anti-sentiment going on. So I'm going to go through in detail 3 of the main arguments that I found that Mormon women use to defend polygamy. And there was, of course, more than this, but these were just the main ones that I identified. So the first one was that polygamy is protected under our First Amendment rights. And that means that Mormons should have the right to practice polygamy because it's a religious belief, it's a religious practice. And the United States government walked around that by saying, well, you can believe whatever you want, but you can't do whatever you want. And so this was an idea that was supported by the Supreme Courts, that you can have free belief, but not necessarily free practice. And so it was, anyway, so because of this stance that the government took, that of free practice versus free belief, they were able to pass 3 anti-polygamy laws, and they gradually increased in severity and effectiveness in putting the kibosh on polygamy. And here's some quotes about this. The liberty they, our revolutionary fathers, fought for and bled for, that their children might enjoy the freedom to worship God according to their own conscience, has been denied into their direct descendants. That's a quote from the Woman's Exponent, just kind of lamenting the fact that even though they had fathers that fought in the Revolutionary War, they're not getting the privilege of those freedoms that their fathers fought for. And then this is a quote from a senator that basically just talks about how he supports the bill because it doesn't limit belief, just practice. Says, if I suppose or believe, or if I could be made to perceive that there was anywhere in the text of this lay in Eve concealed any purpose or intent to interfere with the religious belief of even the humblest member of the Mormon Church, any attempt to interfere with the opinions entertained upon religious questions, I would disavow it. I would retract so far as I might my concurrence with this conference report, but I do not understand it. So basically that's just him saying like, hey, nobody's limiting practice, not belief. So it's A-OK. All right. Another big issue was this idea that Mormon women were sex slaves, and that they were held in positions akin to slavery. And this came, I think, a lot from the Republican Party stance that they wanted to expunge the twin relics of barbarism, slavery, and polygamy, and Polygamy activists use that connection in people's heads between slavery and polygamy to really popularize this idea that Mormon women were sex slaves, that they were powerless, that they were being held in these horrible situations outside of the rule of law against their own will, yada, yada, yada. And Mormon women were very upset about this because they're like, this is something we're choosing, this is an expression of a religious devotion, you have no right to say those kinds of things. But those voices were of Mormon women saying, like, we're doing this of our own free choice, no one's being forced into marriages, were ignored to the extent that the federal government believed this tale of Mormon women as sex slaves so much that they donated they gave $40,000 to an anti-polygamy group in Salt Lake City to set up a shelter for abused polygamous women. That totally flopped. There was only like 4 women in 2 years who went to this abused polygamous woman shelter. Here's a quote that's talking about this. So this is from the woman's exponent, a Mormon woman, saying that she's really upset about being called a slave. It says, they talked about liberating the slaves, the woman, Mormon woman, of course, until the Mormon women acknowledged themselves this position and assumed the attitude of slaves, pleading deliverance. Such sentiments are a gross insult to our womanhood, and we decidedly resent it. And then this second quote is really interesting because it's from Anna Eliza Young. She was one of the foremost activists against polygamy, and she was an ex-wife of President Brigham Young. So it says, can you not help me? Thousands of women, some of them your countrywomen and your equals in moral and intellectual worth, are held in a more revolting slavery today. The system that blights every woman's life who enters it ought not to remain a curse and a stain upon this nation any longer than it should be blotted out so completely that even its foul memory should die. So what's really interesting here is because there is a lot of racist sentiment going on in the United States now and back then. But particularly back in the day where it was very acceptable to be racist, women are made out to be in a situation, are like a group. There are these white women living in Utah. A lot of them are from the East, so they're really a sympathetic group. And the thought of people just like them being made into sex slaves or being held in this position of slavery is just absolutely abhorrent to so many people, and particularly women back East. And so this rhetoric of making Mormon women slavery worse than African slavery, you see a lot coming up in the sources that I read. All right, the third argument for polygamy was that it was divinely sanctioned by God. And this is a response to the claim that polygamy causes the breakdown of societies. And because it was divinely sanctioned by God, the Mormon women claim that it helps them refine themselves, it has precedence in the Bible, and it enhances the virtue of their husbands in their communities, which is really different than what was being said back east of this polygamy thing is going to break down your societies, it's going to break down families, it's going to ruin religiosity, which is funny that they said that polygamy caused the breakdown of societies, because if anyone had been to a Mormon town in Utah, they would have seen that there were no saloons, there were no brothels, and that generally speaking, the level of virtue was higher in a Mormon town than it was in anywhere else, just because it was a religious community that didn't support those activities. So the irony abounds. But these arguments that the Mormon woman made that it was divinely sanctioned of God, that it was part of their religion, were ignored or cheapened by this argument that was made in many, many sources that Mormon women were either ignorant or they were fanatic. So they were I think a lot of sources refer to them as like dumb cattle who don't know anything, which is obviously not great. And then other ones just said they were driven absolutely crazy by fanaticism for their religion, because to so many people that were anti-polygamous, they couldn't believe that any woman in her right mind who was intelligent would agree to marry a man that already had a wife. So here's some quotes about this. This is one from N.M. Tracy, and the woman's exponent claims its precedence in the Bible. It says, if we be the children of Abraham, then ought we not to do the works of Abraham? So that's just in referring to the fact that Abraham did have multiple wives. And then this one is from Orson Hyde, and it kind of deals with this concept of Mormon women being fanatic and having to defend their religion because of the position it put them in. It says, the most enthusiastic arguments in favor of polygamy are used by some of the women. That, however, is natural enough. If polygamy be not the commandment of God as they believe it, then they would feel their fate as others see it. For them to see themselves deceived is to know themselves dishonored. to maintain their own self-respect, they must maintain their own self-deception and be brought to this standpoint. They blindly believe and as blindly obey all they are commanded. Degraded into slavery by this Mormon step back into barbarism, they are almost as submissive and as miserable as the Indian squaws around them. So this idea that Orson Hyde is talking about is really actually quite something. It manages to bundle every argument a Mormon woman could make in defense of polygamy and make it worthless because they're only defending it to maintain their own self-deception so that they don't know that they've been trapped into this lie of moral degeneracy. And so really Mormon women are backed into this corner where if you're quiet, you're like stupid as a cow, and that's the only reason you're in polygamy. And if you're outspoken, then you're just crazy fanatic. You're like the Karen of all Karens. You're just completely out of your mind. And you're kicking against this argument, up against these arguments that polygamy is morally degenerate because you refuse to see yourself as morally degenerate. And so, in conclusion, as you can see from everything I've talked about, the voices of Mormon women in defense of polygamy didn't make that much of an impact at the time. They were ignored, they were labeled as fanatic, they were drowned out by this absolute flood of anti-Mormon sentiment that was in the media. But just because it didn't make a lot of impact at the time, I don't think we can discount the historical impact that these women made by defending polygamy. They left an extremely valuable record that can cause people to look at all sides of the situation and kind of start to question what really was going on here. What were the motivations of these women who were practicing polygamy? Why did they practice it seemingly willingly for most of them? And what can we learn from them? And I think polygamy is an uncomfortable topic for a lot of us. No one really wants it to come back. I certainly do not want to be in a polygamous relationship ever at any point in my life, as I think most people would agree. It's not something I desire, but I really, as I've studied polygamy more and more, I've come to respect the men and women who practice polygamy and the sacrifice of personal happiness that they made in order to follow the commandments of God. And I think if we can look past the inherent repulsion that comes from this idea of having multiple wives that is offensive to our Western sensibilities, we can see that the faith of these men and women who practice polygamy is extremely inspiring, and we can learn from them about how we can be more courageous in following God in our own lives.